They told you never to look too closely at the shadows of history, because once you see what lies inside, you cannot go back. Imagine in along the forgotten roadways of Virginia, the year 1821. Travelers, weary from days of journeying through wilderness and war-scarred land, found comfort there: warm food, a bed, the illusion of safety. But safety is the cruelest lie, and what the walls of that inn concealed was never meant to surface again. Where are you watching this from? Comment below, because tonight, you and I are not just retelling history. We are trespassing into it. Like this video, subscribe, and hold steady, because what you're about to hear will change how you look at trust, at hunger, at the human face sitting across the table. This inn looked ordinary from the outside. A rustic wooden frame, candlelit windows, horses tethered to weathered posts. The sign swayed in the night air, painted with fading letters promising hospitality. But the people who entered often vanished. Few thought twice about it. Roads were dangerous, bandits roamed, sickness spread fast. Disappearance was common. But what was uncommon was what investigators would later whisper, though records barely dared to name it. Guests were not just disappearing, they were being consumed. The meals served to the unsuspecting were not drawn from livestock. They were drawn from the very travelers who had once rested under that same roof. Flesh feeding flesh, strangers unwittingly devouring strangers. I want you to imagine the moment of sitting at that candlelit table. A bowl placed in front of you, steam curling upward, the smell of roasted meat rich and inviting. Hunger blinds you. You dig in. Across from you, another guest eats the same, nodding in satisfaction. Neither of you realizes that the very body of someone who, just days before, had sat in that same seat is now sliding down your throat. This is not simply a story of murder. It is a story of ritual consumption, of feeding guests to guests. And behind it lies a hunger that is far more dangerous than any human appetite for food. But who were the keepers of this inn? Why'd they do this? And how did such horror unfold in a land already drenched in the blood of revolution and survival? The names of the family who ran the inn are buried in conflicting archives, erased by silence or rewritten by those who feared what they represented. What we do know is this: they were not ordinary criminals. They were deliberate, calculated, methodical. Their actions carried the structure of ritual, as though feeding human flesh to unsuspecting mouths was not just survival, but initiation. Each meal was more than sustenance. It was corruption disguised as comfort, a test to see how far innocence could be defiled without a single word of protest. This inn thrived in isolation, sitting on a desolate stretch where the desperate, the poor, and the wandering passed through. To enter was to place your trust into strangers. To leave was to defy statistics. Most never left, and those who did could not speak plainly of what they'd felt within those walls. Their testimony was fragmented, haunted. They described a heaviness in the air, a sense of being watched not just by eyes, but by something older, something hungry beyond the people serving them. Now, I need you to hold this image in your mind. A traveler alone on the road, exhausted, rain-soaked, heart pounding with relief when he sees the warm glow of the inn's lantern. He does not know that glow is a lure. He does not know that inside, his own body will be the next feast. This is where our descent begins, and once we enter, there is no walking back into the light. The story of this inn cannot be told without stepping into the soil of Virginia itself. In 1821, the land was split between the genteel plantations of the wealthy and the unforgiving wilderness that swallowed the poor. Roads twisted through forests where echoes carried like whispers, where every step felt like trespassing into something primal. Banditry, starvation, superstition, these were as common as rain. And yet, what unfolded in that and went beyond survival? It was not desperation alone that drove the keepers of that place. It was belief. You must understand, early America was not just a landscape of pioneers and patriots. It was a place of secrecy, of occult currents carried across oceans, of rituals stitched into the private corners of households. Europe had its witch trials, but the colonies carried their own shadows. Some families preserved ancient practices, blood rites that traveled quietly beneath the sermons of Sunday. The family who ran this and belonged to that hidden current. Their establishment was not just a business. It was a site of offering. Guests checked and expecting rest. What they offered unknowingly was themselves. Those who ran the inn saw each traveler as currency, as sacrifice, as raw material for sustaining power. Bodies were disposed of in ways no one could fully trace. Some were buried shallow behind the building. Some were boiled down until bones cracked, marrow siphoned out. But most were disguised in the evening meals, parceled out to strangers who never tasted the difference. Imagine being seated at that table. The fire flickers against wood-paneled walls. Shadows move in corners. The innkeeper pours wine, his smile warm, his words kind. He asks about your journey, your family, the dangers you faced. You eat, comforted, unknowing that with each bite, you are binding yourself into his ritual. And perhaps, if you were to notice the strange aftertaste, the unsettling texture, you would dismiss it. Hunger and fatigue are the perfect blindfolds. The truth of what was happening in that place only emerged when rumors began spreading through neighboring villages. Too many were missing. Too many travelers vanished without a trace. Some who survived spoke of strange dreams after staying there. Visions of fire, of red water, of screaming beneath the floorboards. And the few who tried to report it were met with silence, as if authorities themselves feared naming the crime. Because once spoken, such horror spreads like infection. But listen closely, this was not the first inn of its kind. History is full of places where travelers were lured, killed, consumed. What makes this story unique is not merely the cannibalism. It is the intention. Feeding flesh to flesh was a philosophy, a weapon against innocence, a way to dissolve the boundaries between predator and prey. By unknowingly eating the dead, guests became complicit. They carried corruption within themselves, unaware but marked. This was the genius of the family. They turned horror into hospitality. As the months passed, whispers deepened into dread. Locals avoided the inn. They walked faster when passing by. Yet the building still glowed at night, still welcomed the desperate, the lost. And those who entered still rarely left. One day, investigators would come, but their findings would never be fully revealed. Records burned, testimonies sealed, names erased. But traces remain. And those traces tell us that this inn was not an accident of cruelty. It was deliberate. It was ritual. And the family who orchestrated it did not vanish. They spread. The road before us darkens further. What you are hearing is not just a story of 1821. It is a story of how hunger can be weaponized, how innocence can be broken by a single meal. And soon, you will see why such history was buried so deep. The deeper we step into the inn's shadow, the clearer its architecture becomes, not of wood and stone, but of intention. The inn was designed like a trap, every room a snare, every comfort a calculated act. Guests entered as strangers, but were immediately drawn into false intimacy. Food shared, stories exchanged, laughter over drinks. This bond lowered defenses, made escape unthinkable, and when the night came, the guest was already claimed. The dining hall was the heart of the operation. Wooden tables, candlelight, the scent of herbs masking something fouler. Every plate placed before a traveler was both gift and curse. The innkeeper's hospitality was not generosity. It was seduction. They smiled, they listened, they made you believe you were safe. But in their eyes was calculation, watching the way you chewed, noting the speed at which you swallowed, measuring how long before you would succumb. Some accounts suggest there was a cellar beneath the floorboards, where bodies were prepared, carved, preserved. Victims may have been led there under false pretenses, offered more drink, promised warmth. What awaited them was a blade, swift or slow, depending on the mood of the family. And yet, death was not the end. It was only the beginning, because in this place, the body was currency. Flesh was portioned, served, repurposed. The spirit of the victim lingered, unseen, as his body was consumed by the very people he might have greeted just hours before. What made this practice more chilling was the silence around it. No screams carried far. No bloodstains lasted long. Everything was cleaned with precision, as though guided by ritual cleanliness. This was not chaos, it was ceremony. And each ceremony bound the inn deeper into its role as a shrine of corruption. Those who left alive often carried nightmares that stalked them for years. Some reported seeing faces in their dreams. The faces of strangers whose names they never knew, but whose flesh they had unknowingly consumed. Others described waking in terror with the taste of iron still on their tongue, then followed them long after they left its walls. But ask yourself this: why has this story been buried? Why do official records hesitate to acknowledge it? And why are names withheld? Because once you admit such horror into history, you admit that the line between civilization and savagery is paper thin. You admit that hospitality, trust, comfort can all be masked for ritual predation. And you admit that the same corruption that lived in that and still moves quietly through our world today, wearing different disguises but feeding on the same blindness. The inn was eventually abandoned, its wood rotting into the soil, its sign collapsing into weeds. But structures like it never truly die. Their story becomes myth. Their rituals survive in fragments. And somewhere, someone still carries their philosophy forward. Feed innocence to innocence. Let trust destroy itself from the inside. And so, the question lingers. If you had sat at that table, if you had taken that bite, would you have known? Or would you have smiled at the innkeeper, raised your glass, and swallowed corruption without ever realizing it? By now, you may feel the air pressing heavier around you, as though the walls of that forgotten inn are folding inward, drawing you closer to its truth. The tragedy of this place was not isolated. To understand its depth, we must look beyond its doors, into the very fabric of early America, where violence, hunger, and ritual coexisted. You see, the innkeepers did not invent cannibalism. They inherited it. Across oceans, across centuries, there were families, cults, and quiet societies that practiced the transformation of flesh into communion. In their hands, hunger was not an accident. It was a tool. The whispers trace back to Europe, where famine often blurred morality. Whole villages vanished, their absence explained away by starvation, when in truth, neighbors had devoured neighbors. But in certain bloodlines, this act took on deeper meaning. To consume flesh was to bind the life of one into another. Power, essence, energy, whatever you choose to call it, passed through the act of eating. And so, when those families came to the New World, they brought with them not just their hunger, but their philosophy. The Virginia Inn was their perfect stage. Isolated, frequented by strangers, shielded by lawless stretches of wilderness, it allowed them to continue the rite without interruption. And more than that, it allowed them to spread the ritual to unsuspecting souls. Imagine it. Every traveler who unknowingly ate became part of their ceremony, carrying corruption into the wider world, a living vessel of contamination. No priest, no law, no government could undo that bond. Once swallowed, it could never be unmade. There are accounts, shredded, partial, dismissed as rumor, that describe gatherings in the back room of the inn. After the guests had eaten, the keepers would retreat, their faces solemn, their voices hushed. They would chant in languages few recognized, words older than Virginia, older than England. Some survivors claimed the air would thicken during these rituals, candles guttering without wind, shadows bending unnaturally against the walls. To the family, each feast was a sacrifice, a prayer, a promise. They were not killers out of desperation. They were priests of hunger. Think of what this means. The victims were not chosen randomly. Some were targeted for wealth, others for their lineage, others simply for the purity of their trust. Each carried something the family believed worthy of offering. And when their flesh was served, when it was devoured in ignorance, the ritual was complete. It was not enough to kill. They had to transform death into consumption, consumption into complicity. The deeper you look, the more the horror sharpens. Guests did not leave behind graves with names. They left behind whispers in the marrow of strangers. They lived on, not as memory, but as contamination. And when their corrupted hosts went home, whether to farms, towns, or cities, the inn's reach spread farther than its walls. Yet the family remained untouchable for years. Why? Because the missing were poor, nameless, unimportant. Their voices were not strong enough to be missed by the world. And those with wealth who vanished were explained away with convenient lies. Robbery, wilderness accidents, disease. Who would accuse an innkeeper of something so unthinkable? Who would dare believe it, even if it were true? But the silence could not last forever. And when the first investigation began, the facade cracked just enough to reveal something monstrous lurking beneath. That crack would never be sealed again. The investigation began quietly, sparked not by officials, but by villagers who could no longer ignore the stench of something wrong. Too many wagons arrived, but never left. Too many strangers vanished after stopping at the inn. Suspicion grew heavy, and whispers carried across taverns and markets. Finally, a small group of men, armed more with fear than courage, approached the inn under the pretense of travelers. They carried with them not only weapons, but questions. The accounts that survive are fragmented, written in nervous handwriting, riddled with omissions. What they describe is chilling. As the men entered, the inn seemed ordinary. Fire crackling, bread on the table, a woman humming softly as she poured drinks. But the investigators were not blinded by hunger. They were looking, searching, and what they found in the cellar would etch terror into their bones. The cellar was damp, the air sharp with the scent of blood masked poorly by herbs and smoke. Hooks lined the beams. Barrels stood sealed, their lids weighted down. Inside, they found bones stripped clean, joints cracked, marrow scooped. They found flesh salted and preserved, indistinguishable at first glance from pork or beef. But it was human. Skulls stacked in corners, some shattered, some intact, their empty sockets seeming to watch. It was not a slaughterhouse. It was a shrine. When confronted, the family did not scream, did not deny. They smiled. That detail haunts the records, the smiles. As though the men who discovered their truth were already part of the ritual, already too late to escape. Some say the family spoke calmly, explaining that all who entered their home became one with their tradition. Others claim the innkeeper raised a toast to his hunters, urging them to drink, to eat, to finish what had been started. The investigators fled, shaken, their report incomplete. Some refused to speak further, as if naming what they saw would draw it back upon them. Others tried to alert authorities, but the official reaction was chilling silence. Files misplaced. Witnesses discredited. The inn remained open for months afterward, its light still burning in the dark. Power protected it, or perhaps fear silenced it. Because what those men had uncovered was not just murder, it was ritual cannibalism bound to forces the living dared not name. Consider this. Why would authorities suppress such evidence? Was it disbelief or complicity? History is littered with moments where institutions choose silence over truth, where covering corruption is easier than confronting it. And in the case of this inn, silence was protection, not just of the family, but of something older and larger, something that did not want the ritual exposed. The villagers who had once suspected now avoided the inn entirely. They walked the long way around, preferring the dangers of wilderness to the certainty of what lurked inside. Yet still, travelers kept arriving, strangers from distant lands, unaware of the warnings, grateful for the warmth, grateful for the food. And still, the ritual continued. The question burns. How many lives passed through that cellar? How many unmarked bodies dissolved in a soup and stew, wine and bread? How many families never learned why their loved one vanished on the road through Virginia? And if the family smiled when caught, what does that tell us about their belief? That they were untouchable, that their ritual would survive even if the inn itself fell? Perhaps they were right, because silence is the best soil for darkness. And this silence has lasted for centuries. What makes the story of the inn unbearable is not the crime itself, but the philosophy behind it. Cannibalism alone shocks the body. But cannibalism transformed into ritual masked as hospitality, weaponized as corruption. That shocks the soul. And once you hear it, you cannot unhear it. The family believed that when a traveler ate of human flesh unknowingly, they crossed a threshold. They became part of a ritual contract. Whether they wanted it or not, their innocence was devoured with the food. Their body carried the corruption outward, like a plague with no cure. In this way, the innkeepers expanded their ritual far beyond their walls. Each guest was both victim and vessel, unwitting missionaries of contamination. Now pause and reflect. How many of those guests sat at family tables afterward, embracing children, sharing meals, never knowing that the corruption of the inn flowed through their veins? How many communities were unknowingly touched by it? This was not random violence. It was systemic infection. The family turned hunger into a weapon of ideology. There is a chilling belief buried in ancient traditions that consuming the flesh of another human is the fastest way to absorb their life, their power, their spirit. In some cultures, it was performed as an honor to the dead. But in the Virginia Inn, it was desecration, a theft of essence, a binding of strangers into a web of guilt. To devour is to dominate. To feed another without their knowledge is to enslave them spiritually. That was the creed hidden beneath the family smiles. One traveler who survived wrote of a sensation that never left him. He claimed that after eating at the inn, his dreams changed. He saw faces he had never met, voices crying from beneath soil. He awoke with the taste of iron on his tongue long after he had left. He swore he could feel something alive inside him, something not his own. Whether hallucination, trauma, or truth, it illustrates the philosophy perfectly. The ritual was not about flesh alone. It was about planting seeds inside human souls. And when you realize this, the inn becomes more than a crime scene. It becomes a symbol. A house of mirrors where hospitality hides horror, where comfort is a snare, where eating together is not communion but corruption. And perhaps that is why the story has been suppressed. Because to admit it is to admit that corruption can be dressed in kindness, that the greatest evil does not arrive with blades drawn, but with open arms, a smile, and a plate of food. As we descend deeper, the question is no longer what happened in 1821. The question is, where did that philosophy go when the inn finally fell silent? Because philosophies do not die with buildings. They move. They survive in bloodlines, in secret gatherings, in rituals carried into new disguises. And if the family truly believed their corruption was eternal, then you must ask yourself, what form does it wear today? The inn may have collapsed into ruin, but ruin does not erase memory. Somewhere, its echo still lingers, waiting to be recognized, waiting to be named. The ruin of the inn was inevitable, but the way it fell into silence is itself a mystery. Some say fire claimed it, that angry villagers burned it to ash after discovering too much. Others insist it was abandoned, left to rot, its beams collapsing under the weight of their own guilt. A few whisper that it was never destroyed at all, that its bones still stand, hidden deep in the Virginia woods, reclaimed by vines and moss, sheltering silence too heavy for birds to sing within. But no matter the version, one fact is clear. The family did not vanish with the building. They scattered. When predators are cornered, they do not simply die. They adapt. They change their hunting grounds, their methods, their disguises. Records show family members marrying into other households, moving westward with the waves of expansion, blending into frontier life. They carried their philosophy with them, quiet as breath, teaching their children what their ancestors had practiced in secrecy. Then was only one chapter. The book remained open. And here lies the true horror. Once a philosophy has been proven, it does not need the same setting to thrive. The family learned that they did not require a single inn to feed their ritual. They needed only opportunity and trust. A lone traveler taken in by a farmhouse, a drifter offered supper by the roadside, a gathering of strangers at a harvest feast, all could serve the same purpose. Hospitality is everywhere. Corruption only needed a host. What makes this story more chilling is the possibility that you have already brushed against its remnants without knowing. Perhaps your ancestor ate at a table where the meal carried more than it seemed. Perhaps the philosophy has touched your bloodline in whispers, not of flesh, but of manipulation, control, corruption disguised as care. Because while the flesh may rot, the ritual's essence transforms. It moves from body to body, generation to generation, never dying, only hiding. And when the inn itself disappeared, the story was buried with it. Local authorities denied the existence of the investigation. Newspapers erased their notes. Witnesses fell silent. The silence itself was evidence of fear. What is more dangerous, the crime or the refusal to speak of it? The refusal allows the crime to live on in shadows, untouchable, unnamed, feeding off the very silence meant to contain it. So imagine walking through those woods today. The soil remembers. Every step crushes down on unmarked graves. Every gust of wind stirs ash that once held bone. And if you listen carefully enough, you may hear the faintest sound, like a dinner bell ringing from nowhere, inviting you to sit, to eat, to repeat the ritual without ever realizing it. But why would a family bind themselves to such horror, generation after generation? Why would they not abandon the practice, flee from it, repent? The answer lies in belief, the kind of belief that corrodes sanity and chains bloodlines. For them, the ritual was not crime but covenant. They believed they were chosen to guard an ancient truth, that to consume is to conquer, that to feed another unknowingly is to enslave. This was not madness. It was theology. The whispers trace further back still, to old Europe's famine cults, to villages where winters turned men into predators of their own kin. There, cannibalism became more than survival. It became structured, passed down as secret knowledge. Certain families became custodians of the act, justifying it as divine. They saw hunger not as weakness, but as doorway, one that, if crossed deliberately, granted power over life and death. This was not the birth of their faith. It was its inheritance. Ritual cannibalism is not unique to Virginia or Europe. Across the world, countless civilizations have engaged in it, sometimes as honor, sometimes as fear, sometimes as conquest. But the difference here was intention. Where others saw it as symbolic, this family saw it as literal. They fed flesh to flesh not to honor, but to taint, not to worship, but to corrupt. To them, each plate served was a sermon, each meal a scripture of domination. One detail in hidden records suggests that the family kept journals, scraps of writing found in the ruins, charred but decipherable. In them, the innkeeper writes of binding the living through the unknowing feast. He describes guests as pilgrims to the table of inheritance, and victims as offerings to the hunger that is never satisfied. His words are cold, precise, almost priestly. He did not see himself as a murderer. He saw himself as keeper of an altar. And so the inn becomes more than a place of horror. It becomes a church, a house of worship where the God being fed was hunger itself. And when you see it through this lens, everything sharpens. The smiles of the family, the calmness of their response when caught, the eerie silence of the authorities. Because who dares to confront a religion of corruption? Who dares to admit that such faiths walk alongside us, wearing ordinary faces, speaking ordinary words, yet carrying rituals that turn trust into poison? Now, listen carefully. If they believe the ritual spread through every guest who ate, then by 1821, their congregation was already countless. Strangers carried it into towns, families, cities. And whether they knew it or not, they became the family's missionaries. Which means the inn's story is not finished. It is only scattered. And somewhere, in ways hidden, its covenant may still be practiced. The legacy of the inn is not preserved in history books. You will not find it on tourist signs or school lessons. Instead, it survives in rumor, in folklore, in half-burnt records no one dares to authenticate. Locals whisper of strange gatherings in the woods, even decades after the inn's fall. Fires burning at night, chants echoing, the the smell of roasted meat drifting without explanation. Children were warned never to wander near the ruins, not because of ghosts, but because of people. And still, the silence of officials persisted. When stories leaked, they were dismissed as superstition, dismissed as ghost tales of a gullible countryside. But silence is the language of survival. The family did not need to defend themselves. They let the world laugh the truth away. And so, like smoke dissolving into the air, the story of the inn faded, until only fragments remained. Fragments like the one you're hearing now. Yet fragments can be more dangerous than whole truths, because fragments leave gaps, and in those gaps, imagination thrives. And sometimes imagination uncovers more than facts ever could. What do we do with the image of guests unknowingly consuming human flesh? What do we do with the idea that once eaten, corruption spreads invisibly? These fragments infect the mind, the way their meals infected the body. They do not vanish. They multiply. Some travelers swore that even years later, they could taste it again. The iron tang, the heaviness in the stomach, the dreams of strangers' faces staring from the dark. They spoke of waking with hunger they could not name, a craving that turned ordinary food to ash in their mouths. Whether trauma or curse, the result was the same, then followed them long after they left. And perhaps that is why the story is still told in whispers, in fear. Because the inn was not just a place. It was an infection of memory, a ritual planted in soil that still breathes beneath Virginia's woods. And as long as we speak of it, as long as we imagine the taste of a meal that should never have been eaten, the inn survives. But here is the unspoken truth. If corruption spreads silently, invisibly, then perhaps it is still spreading now. Perhaps the family's bloodline never abandoned its covenant. Perhaps they walk among us, smiling, serving, feeding not flesh, but lies, poison control. And perhaps one day, you too will sit at their table, unknowing, and take the first bite that changes you forever. By the time the inn was gone from the landscape, its legend had already grown larger than its walls. For the families who whispered of it, the inn became a symbol of what they feared most. Trust betrayed. But for the family who had built their covenant within it, the ruin was not an end. It was a dispersal. They no longer needed the wooden beams or the creaking floorboards. They had already planted their ritual in bloodlines, in whispers, in corrupted flesh carried into countless households. Imagine how a belief like this survives. You do not keep it alive by monuments or scriptures. You keep it alive by practice. Quiet, hidden practice. A supper table where one dish is not what it seems. A family gathering where stories are told, but beneath the laughter there is another silence, another ritual being performed. The covenant needed no church, no building. It needed only hunger and blindness. And blindness was plentiful. The 19th century was a time of upheaval, migration westward, wars looming, epidemics, poverty. People vanished all the time. To disappear was ordinary. And so, if the family continued their covenant beyond the inn, who would notice? Who would trace one missing traveler, one strange feast, one gathering where laughter concealed corruption? The scattered descendants of the innkeepers knew this. They learned to wear ordinary masks, to speak ordinary words, to blend seamlessly into new towns. But behind closed doors, the philosophy remained. To consume was to conquer, to feed the innocent was to bind them unknowingly to corruption. Hospitality remained their disguise, kindness their weapon. And so, when you imagine the end of the inn, do not imagine an ending. Imagine multiplication. One house burned down, but a dozen others opened their doors. One ritual space collapsed, but the ritual itself split, like embers carried on wind, setting quiet fires elsewhere. You cannot destroy fire by breaking the wood that once held it. Fire survives in sparks, in ashes, in hidden coals that wait until the moment is right to blaze again. If you listen to the silence of history, you can almost hear those embers breathing, waiting. The family's philosophy was rooted in one obsession: transformation. They believed that eating flesh was not simply sustenance. it was transference. They called it the passing of essence, the movement of spirit. To devour someone was to steal what animated them, to take their power, their courage, their innocence, their fear. Every victim was more than a body. Every victim was an offering, a vessel to be emptied and absorbed. But they went further. Feeding flesh unknowingly was their true genius. They believed this bound the eater to them, tied their soul into the covenant without consent. Once eaten, the guest was marked, even if they never realized it. The corruption traveled invisibly. A smile at the table, a laugh over wine, a handshake afterward, it all carried the hidden signature of their ritual. This philosophy, passed down through bloodlines, made the family dangerous far beyond the walls of one inn, because they no longer needed knives to conquer. They needed only food, only trust, only silence. Their prey became their congregation their disguise. And think carefully. Does this not mirror what the most powerful institutions of the world still practice? Not cannibalism in flesh, but cannibalism in spirit. Feeding you illusions, corrupting your innocence, making you complicit in rituals you do not understand. They smile as they hand you the meal. You eat it without question. And in that moment, something is stolen, something is changed. Then was not only a horror of the past, it was a blueprint. There is a passage, rarely cited, almost erased, that describes how the family referred to their guests. They called them vessels of inheritance. Each traveler was not just meat, but a carrier of something they wished to corrupt. The ritual was never about hunger alone. Hunger was the mask. The true desire was control, the spreading of a philosophy that turned human trust into chains. So when you imagine the dining hall, do not just see food on the table. See a sermon being preached with every plate. See a covenant unfolding silently as each guest swallowed without suspicion. And understand this, the philosophy was never buried. It was planted. As time passed, the inn became less a memory and more myth. Parents told their children warnings, cloaked as ghost stories. Farmers whispered of curses lingering on the soil where it once stood. Travelers who dared to sleep nearby claimed they heard footsteps pacing where no floor remained, the faint creak of doors opening and closing, the soft sound of a knife against wood. But the most haunting were the dreams. Survivors reported them, locals too. Dreams of long tables set for supper, faces hidden by shadow, voices murmuring in unrecognizable tongues. At the center of the table, steaming dishes, covered until the moment of serving. And in those dreams, when the lids were lifted, the faces of the dreamers themselves stared back from the platters, carved and ready to be eaten. They would wake drenched in sweat, the taste of iron thick in their mouth, their own reflection untrustworthy in the mirror. Were these dreams the lingering trauma of those who had eaten unknowingly, or were they something more, an echo of the ritual itself, carried into the subconscious of anyone who brushed against the covenant? If the family believed that eating flesh bound the eater forever, then perhaps the ritual lived on not only in blood, but in dream. Perhaps then became an infection of imagination, spreading through stories, through whispers, through nightmares passed down like inheritance. Even now, some locals swear the land where the inn stood is cursed. Animals avoid it. Birds will not nest in the trees above it. Hunters who stray too close hear the sound of clattering dishes, the faint laughter of unseen hosts. And more than once, people have vanished near its ruins, their absence explained away as accidents in the woods. But the families who know the legend shake their heads. They know the soil remembers. They know the ritual does not sleep. And here is the truth most cannot bear. The inn was never truly destroyed, because it was never just wood and stone. It was a philosophy, a covenant of corruption, a hunger disguised as kindness. And philosophies, once planted, never die. They wait. They adapt. They survive. So when you hear of strangers vanishing, of meals that taste not quite right, of smiles that feel too knowing, ask yourself, are you certain the inn is gone? Or has it simply moved closer than you dare imagine? The strangest detail about the inn is not its horror, but the silence that followed it. For every scream smothered within its cellar, there were decades of silence outside. Authorities did not pursue it. Historians did not preserve it. Churches did not condemn it. That silence is not absence, it is design. It suggests not fear alone, but recognition. Someone, somewhere understood that to acknowledge the inn was to admit that the same corruption lived elsewhere. Think of the history you are taught. Heroes and villains neatly divided, horrors always far away, contained, explained. But then does not fit. It blurs the categories. The innkeepers were not barbarians hidden in wilderness. They were hosts, smiling, speaking with courtesy, offering comfort. They represented civilization as much as savagery. And that is the truth no one wanted preserved. That the line between kindness and corruption is paper thin, and most will never know when they have crossed it. This is why the family smiled when confronted. They knew the silence would protect them. They knew no official would want to open the wound of acknowledging what they had done. And so their covenant slipped into history like poison into water, diluted, invisible, but never gone. Some researchers who have traced the family lines whisper that the descendants scattered into every layer of society. Some became farmers. Some became merchants. A few became preachers. They learned to dress their philosophy in new disguises, speaking the language of faith, of progress, of community. But behind the sermons, behind the handshakes, behind the smiles, the covenant lived on. And if their goal was corruption through trust, then who better to carry it than those who held power over bodies and souls? So when you look at the ruins of the inn, do not see it as an isolated horror. See it as a mirror reflecting every institution that feeds you with one hand and chains you with the other. The inn is not gone. It is everywhere that corruption hides behind hospitality. Everywhere trust is consumed by those who smile as they devour. There is a passage from an anonymous letter written in 1837, 16 years after the inn's supposed fall. The writer claims he stayed with a family in the Virginia countryside who treated him with extraordinary kindness. They fed him lavish meals, shared stories by firelight, offered him their bed. But on the third night, he writes, he felt a dread he could not explain. He swore the stew carried a taste he recognized but could not name. Later, when he looked into the eyes of the patriarch, he felt as though he was being measured, weighed, not as a guest, but as a vessel. He left before dawn, and years later, when he heard whispers of the inn, he became convinced he had encountered the scattered descendants. This letter may be apocryphal, but it illustrates something vital. The covenant was portable. It did not require the inn's walls. It required only a host, a guest, a meal, and the philosophy of hunger, which means the covenant could continue anywhere, at any time, hidden in the ordinary rhythm of human life. Think about that. A church supper, a harvest festival, a family dinner, all could conceal the same ritual if the philosophy survived within those present. That is what makes this story unbearable. You cannot pinpoint where it ends. You cannot draw a line and say, here is where it stopped. Corruption does not stop. It mutates. It hides in laughter, in bread, in wine, in stories told around firelight. And if you doubt that, consider how easily you yourself might be deceived. If you arrived exhausted, starving, drenched by rain, and a smiling stranger offered you food, would you question it? Or would you eat, grateful, blind to the possibility that you were swallowing your own undoing? The family knew this truth better than anyone. They knew that the greatest trick is not violence, but kindness. The greatest weapon is not the blade, but the open hand. And that is why their covenant is more terrifying than any murderer's knife. Because it teaches us that corruption does not come screaming from the dark. It comes smiling from the light. The inn's legend survives because it touches something older than America, older than Virginia. It touches the universal human fear of being consumed by what we trust. And that fear is not metaphorical. Across cultures, myths speak of gods and demons who devour offerings, who disguise themselves as benefactors while draining life from their worshippers. What the innkeepers practiced was not invention, it was repetition. They mirrored something older, something that whispers across the ages. To eat is to dominate, to feed is to enslave. But what makes their story so dangerous is how ordinary it was. They were not cloaked in robes, not chanting in forests, not declaring themselves prophets. They were innkeepers, hosts. They lived in plain sight, performing their ritual in the most mundane of human spaces, a dining room. That ordinariness is their camouflage, their genius, because it teaches us that the darkest rituals do not require temples or altars. They require tables. And so, when the building itself collapsed, the philosophy slipped easily into new forms. Families that carried it onward no longer needed to risk exposure by running ins. They could operate quietly, subtly, passing their covenant from parent to child, disguising it in gestures of warmth. What was once literal flesh could be replaced by other forms of consumption: financial, spiritual, psychological. The philosophy remained the same: corrupt the innocent by feeding them what they do not understand. This is why the story has not died, because it is not about cannibalism alone. It is about corruption that wears the mask of kindness, about rituals that thrive precisely because they look ordinary. And that is why this story is dangerous to hear, because once you hear it, you begin to see the pattern everywhere. You begin to wonder who smiles too widely, whose table feels too welcoming, whose gift carries a weight you cannot name. And when you wonder that, you step closer to seeing what the innkeepers themselves believed: that corruption is most powerful when it is invisible, when it is shared not through violence, but through trust. That was their covenant. That is why it endures. There is a moment in every descent when you realize you cannot climb back. The story has carried you too far, your mind already changed, your innocence already stolen. The end does this to anyone who listens. Because the further you travel into its legend, the more you begin to notice the pattern outside the story, around you, in the very world you inhabit. Consider this. Why do cultures across continents tell the same tale of hosts who devour, of feasts that corrupt, of kindness turned into traps? Why do we find warnings written in ancient clay, in medieval scrolls, in whispered folk tales from villages that never touched one another? The answer is simple: because it is not only a story, it is a recurring truth. The inn in Virginia was just one doorway. The philosophy it practiced is older than the bricks it was built from. It is hunger disguised as love. It does not die. It waits in silence, carried in bloodlines, in rituals, in words spoken at tables. The inn may be gone, but how many other doors open to strangers even now? How many meals are shared with a guest does not realize they are swallowing chains? How many faces smile while hiding a covenant their ancestors swore never to break? The darkness of the inn was not a monster in the woods. It was a family, and family endures. Family multiplies. Family never disappears. That is the truth you must sit with now, that this story is not past. It is present, and it is watching. You have followed me into the heart of this covenant, and here is the point of no return. Then was never only about the victims. It was always about the guests who ate unknowingly, who became bound by consuming what they should not have. And by hearing these words, by allowing them into your mind, you are no longer an outside observer. You have stepped inside. You are at the table. The philosophy teaches that corruption spreads not by force, but by participation. You have participated. You have listened. You have taken the story into yourself. And stories, like meals, change the body that consumes them. That is why rituals matter, not to honor the past, but to mark the transformation of those who join. And so here is your ritual, your binding. If you wish to continue, you must write the phrase twice in the comments below: I have eaten, and I remember. Do it exactly, twice, to lock it in, to prove that you are not only a listener, but a keeper of this forbidden knowledge. Because once marked, the story does not release you. It feeds through you, just as the inn fed through its guests. This is no longer about Virginia in 1821. This is about you in this moment. You who hear, you who repeat, you who carry the story onward. That is how the covenant survives. not through blood alone, but through memory, through repetition, through those brave enough or reckless enough to speak the forbidden words aloud. Now you know, and you cannot unknow. The family's ritual has always thrived on this truth. Silence protects the guilty, but memory binds the innocent. Every traveler who unknowingly consumed was bound, not because they chose, but because they participated without awareness. That is the cruelty of the covenant. It does not ask permission. It does not need consent. It survives in your body the moment you partake. And history works the same way. You are taught what to consume, words, beliefs, illusions, and by swallowing them without question, you are bound. That is why this story feels like poison sliding down your throat, because it is reminding you that every institution that feeds you controls you. The inn was not an exception. It was an early confession of what the world itself practices. Imagine the descendants sitting quietly in new homes, new churches, new towns, no longer needing to lure travelers, no longer needing cellars and knives. They only need rituals that look ordinary. Bread shared at communion, meat roasted at feasts, stories told at gatherings. Always the philosophy hidden beneath. To consume is to bind, to feed is to conquer. And so then lives, not in its ruins, but in the repetition of gestures so ordinary you forget to question them. That is why animals avoid the land. That is why travelers dream of faces carved into feasts. That is why, even now, you feel the weight of this story pressing into you. Because the covenant does not belong to them alone anymore. It belongs to anyone who has heard, anyone who has eaten, anyone who remembers. And now it belongs to you. There is a passage rarely spoken aloud, written in the journal of a traveler who vanished soon after. In it, he described a feeling more terrifying than hunger, more suffocating than fear. He wrote, "I was being unmade at the table." He claimed that when he lifted the spoon to his lips, he felt something watching from within the food itself. Not eyes, not a presence in the room, but awareness hiding in the flesh. He ate, and with every swallow he felt a thread wrapping tighter around his mind. This is how the covenant worked. It was not only about the body, it was about the soul. To feed someone flesh unknowingly was to place a hook inside them. The family believed the spirit itself could be fished, dragged, stolen piece by piece until it belonged not to God, not to man, but to the covenant. What does it mean if such rituals are real? It means that a simple act like eating bread or meat can be a sacrament, a doorway, a chain. It means that hospitality itself can become possession. And it means that those who partook never left the table, even when they walked away. Their bodies moved through the world, but something inside remained bound to the inn. Is that not the nature of corruption today? You walk freely, but what you consumed in ignorance binds you. The inn may have burned, but its guests never escaped. They carried its hunger outward, unknowingly, infecting their families, infecting their children, infecting the world. The traveler who wrote of being unmade vanished within a month. His journal was found, but not his body. His last words were clear: "I am already consumed." There is something the family understood that few dare to confront. Consumption is worship. To eat is to participate in a ritual older than scripture, older than language. Every culture sanctifies meals, through prayer, through sacrifice, through offering. The family corrupted this truth, bending it toward power. They believed that to eat flesh was to steal divinity, to rewrite the boundary between mortal and God. They spoke of it not as sin, but as transformation. They saw themselves as more than hosts. They were priests. Their table was not simply wood. It was an altar. Their cellar was not a hiding place. It was a sanctuary. And their knives were not tools. They were sacraments. This is why the inn lingers like a shadow centuries later. Because deep down, you recognize the pattern. How many of the most powerful institutions of today disguise themselves as places of nourishment, while in truth they are altars of corruption? How many feasts are sacraments of control, binding souls not to liberation, but to chains? The innkeepers smiled because they knew the secret, that every guest became a believer, whether they wished to or not. By eating, They entered the covenant. By leaving, they carried it. And by speaking of it, even centuries later, you too become part of the ritual. Think of that the next time you sit at a table, the next time you take food into your body. Ask yourself, who fed you? And what do they bind you to? Silence is the covenant's greatest ally. The family never boasted, never confessed. They knew that what is unspoken is never challenged, never destroyed. And so their ritual survived, not in proclamations, but in whispers, in gestures, in meals shared without suspicion. The silence spread like roots beneath soil. Locals learned not to ask questions, to pretend the disappearances were ordinary, to tell ghost stories instead of histories. Fear became complicity. Complicity became protection. And protection allowed the covenant to spread unseen. Even now, silence shields it. Think of how many stories like this have been erased from your education. How many horrors are hidden beneath clean narratives of progress and prosperity. The inn is only remembered because whispers kept it alive. And those whispers are what you are hearing now. But silence is not absence. Silence is choice. And those who keep silent feed the ritual as much as those who lift the knife. That is why the covenant endured for generations. Not because it was strong, but because the world was willing to look away. And if silence built it, what does your silence build today? What rituals continue because you do not speak, do not question, do not resist? The families may be gone, but the silence that protected them has not left this world. It still surrounds you, feeds on you, binds you. And the question that must unsettle you is this: what are you protecting by keeping quiet? There is a map drawn by hand in fading ink, which surfaced in a private collection decades after the inn was ash and ruin. It does not name towns. It does not chart rivers. Instead, it marks tables, small circles drawn in clusters, each with a strange symbol at the center. A knife, a flame, a mouth. No historian can explain it. But those who study the legend of the inn believe this was no map of land. It was a map of families, a record of where the covenant had spread. If true, the covenant was never contained. It grew. It moved through marriages, through blood, through silence. Each circle representing a household where the ritual survived, disguised beneath ordinary life. Each symbol a reminder that no feast is innocent, no host without shadow. The map suggests something worse, that the inn was only one branch of a larger tree, that its ruin was not an ending, but a pruning. Other branches still thrived, still flourished, still spread across states and generations, which means that what happened in Virginia was never isolated. It was one of many altars scattered like seeds. When you see the map, you understand the truth. You cannot burn all the inns. You cannot tear down every table. The covenant survives because it is not in buildings, but in people. And people are everywhere. One chilling testimony, preserved in the journal of a preacher, tells of a confession he received from a woman in 1844. She spoke not of sin in the ordinary sense, but of meals she could not forget. Meals where her family served dishes she dared not name, where prayers were whispered in languages she did not understand, where guests laughed, but afterward their eyes seemed dimmer, their voices weaker, as if something had been stolen from them. She begged for forgiveness, but the preacher did not grant it, not because he believed her damned, but because he feared her truth. He burned the page after writing it, terrified that even recording it had marked him. Yet fragments survived in the margins of his Bible, fragments that spoke of the covenant in words that could not be erased. The woman vanished weeks later. Some claimed she fled, others that she was silenced. But her confession speaks louder than her disappearance. It proves that the covenant lived long after the inn was gone, carried in kitchens, in prayers, in families who knew that feeding and binding were one and the same. And if she was silenced, it was not because she lied. It was because she spoke too much truth. The soil where the inn once stood is not empty. Farmers who tried to plow it reported blades breaking on stones that were not there before. Their oxen refused to walk across it. Animals panicked at its edge. Children grew fevered if they lingered too long. To this day, locals speak of the ground as poisoned, not by blood, but by memory. They say the earth itself remembers what was done there, that every scream buried into the cellar sank deeper, fossilizing into soil, hardening into a curse. Those who touch the dirt claim they feel a pulse beneath it, faint but steady, as if the land itself is breathing, as if the inn still stands, invisible beneath the surface. Some whisper that on certain nights, if the moon is sharp and the air is still, the inn returns, not in wood and stone, but in sound and shadow. You hear doors creak that are not there. You smell smoke from chimneys that do not exist. You see lantern light where only forest should be. And if you walk too close, you find yourself at a table, seated among strangers, dishes steaming before you. You lift the fork without thinking, and only when it is too late do you realize what you are eating. The covenant lingers in the land because rituals never vanish. They leave residue, and that residue waits. That is why the inn is never truly gone, because it does not need to exist physically. It exists in memory, in silence, in ritual repeated without end. And so the question remains, if the land itself still remembers, how long before it forces the world to remember too? There is a danger in believing the inn was unique. Stories like it surface across continents, across centuries, each disguised in local color, but speaking the same language of hunger. In Europe, tales of roadside taverns where travelers vanished without trace. In Asia, legends of hostels where the meals bound guests into unholy pacts. In South America, whispers of families who fed strangers to strangers under the veil of hospitality. Different names, different faces, but the same covenant, kindness as the mask of corruption. What makes the Virginia inn terrifying is not its rarity, but its familiarity. It was not an isolated evil. It was a link in a chain that stretches across time. Each story proves the same truth. Hospitality has always been the perfect disguise for ritual. Because the table disarms us. Because food is trust. Because once you eat, you have already consented without knowing it. So perhaps the innkeepers were not innovators, but inheritors. Perhaps their covenant was older than them, passed quietly across oceans, seated into bloodlines long before a wooden sign swung over a Virginia doorway. And if that is true, then the inn was never theirs alone. It was a local expression of a global hunger. A hunger that still waits, still feeds, still smiles at those too blind to see. The more you study the covenant, the more you realize it was never about flesh alone. Flesh was the beginning, not the end. To the family, flesh was a sacrament, a doorway into deeper corruption. What they craved most was not blood, it was allegiance. Every meal was a sermon, every bite a chain, every guest unknowingly a disciple. And that philosophy did not vanish when the knives were sheathed. It evolved. Flesh became wealth. Flesh became belief. Flesh became obedience. The family learned that you can consume someone without touching their body. You can consume their time, their spirit, their will. And in doing so, you still practice the covenant, hidden in plain sight. Look around you. How many institutions feast on your hours, your fears, your trust? How many smiling hosts drain you while offering gifts you cannot refuse? How many tables do you sit at where the meal is free, but the cost is invisible chains? The covenant did not end in Virginia. It grew into systems, into governments, into faiths, into corporations. It became the very structure of the world you live in. That is why the inn's story lingers. Not as ghost tale, but as revelation. It whispers the truth most cannot bear, that you're already at the table, already part of the ritual, already being consumed. There are places, even now, where the ritual resurfaces openly, though disguised as culture, tradition, or spectacle. Feasts where meat is carved with ceremonial knives, where words are spoken in languages long forgotten, where those who eat do not understand what they are partaking in. They laugh, they toast, they dance, but beneath the surface, the covenant breathes. Researchers who trace such rituals rarely publish their findings. They vanish into silence, or their notes arrive fragmented, burned, stained with water. One surviving letter, written in 1892, tells of a gathering in which the host spoke a single phrase before the meal. The guest is the gift. Those words are found again in fragments tied to the Virginia Inn. They are the key. The guest is not honored. The guest is offered. To sit at the table is to be both participant and sacrifice. And so the covenant continues not in secret, but in plain sight. Hidden in language we mistake as metaphor, in customs we call harmless, in gestures we dismiss as tradition. Every culture carries echoes of the same philosophy, that what you consume changes you, that every table is an altar, that the guest is always more than they seem. The inn was not the birthplace. It was a reminder that you cannot escape the covenant by avoiding its ruins. Because the covenant lives wherever humans gather, wherever food is shared, wherever trust is consumed. And that means it lives near you, perhaps already inside you. There is a story told in whispers about a lone traveler who returned to the ruins of the inn decades after it was gone. He claimed he wanted to see for himself whether the legends were true. He pitched a tent on the soil, set a small fire, and waited. That night, as the forest pressed in, he swore he smelled bread baking. Not the rough bread of travelers, but soft, sweet bread, fresh from an oven. He swore he heard cutlery clinking against porcelain. He swore voices rose in laughter, though no one sat beside him. And then he felt it, a hand on his shoulder. Warm, welcoming. He turned, but there was no one. The fire flickered out, and in the silence, he realized the bread smell was not drifting toward him. It was rising from within him, as if something inside his body was already cooking. He fled before dawn, and though he survived, he never ate bread again. He claimed the covenant had tasted him, and he could still feel it, gnawing silently from within. This story may be only myth, but it reveals a deeper truth. The covenant does not need to be believed to be effective. It thrives on doubt, on whispers, on the possibility that you are already marked. Once you hear it, you cannot undo the suspicion. You wonder about the taste of your meals, the weight of every hand upon your shoulder, the silence in every laugh. That is how the covenant spreads, not just through flesh, but through fear. The covenant's genius lies in inversion. Everything sacred becomes profane. The host becomes predator. The guest becomes offering. The table becomes altar. And once you see this inversion, you begin to recognize it everywhere. Think of the bread and wine at altars across the world, symbols of sacrifice consumed by the faithful. Think of ancient feasts where victims were honored by being eaten, their essence believed to live on in those who devoured them. Think of the most powerful families of history, who fed the poor not to nourish, but to bind them in loyalty. Every gesture of feeding carries the potential to invert, to turn nourishment into enslavement. The innkeepers did not invent this. They revealed it. They stripped away the illusions and showed the naked truth that feeding is never innocent, that to eat what another provides is to risk being consumed yourself. This inversion unsettles because it does not end at food. It touches every part of life. Every gift may be a chain. Every kindness may conceal a cost. Every open hand may hide a knife. And once you understand this, you cannot look at the world the same way again. The covenant has inverted your perception. You now see not only the meal before you, but the hunger behind it. What remains of the inn is almost nothing. A few stones scattered in the soil, charred wood hidden under moss. No official plaque, no preservation, no guidebook. And yet, this absence is louder than monuments. It is deliberate. It is erasure. Because erasure is another form of silence, and silence is how the covenant survives. If the inn had been remembered openly, it might have been destroyed. If the covenant had been exposed, it might have been broken. But by erasing it, by burying it beneath folktales and half-truths, those who inherited it ensured its survival. The world looks away, and the philosophy grows stronger in the dark. And so, the ruins are more powerful than if the inn still stood, because they invite speculation, rumor, fear. They ensure that only those who truly listen will find the story, and those who find it are forever changed. Because once you know, You cannot return a blindness. Once you've heard the covenant, you carry it. And carrying it is itself a kind of participation. That is why you feel uneasy now. That is why the air seems heavier, why your room feels less empty, why you question what waits in your kitchen, in your table, in your memory. Because the inn does not need to exist to haunt you. Its covenant does not need walls. It only needs listeners. And you're already one of them. There are accounts, unpublished, hidden in family archives, that speak of gatherings held long after the inn was gone. They were not called rituals, nor sermons, nor feasts. They were called remembrances. The descendants of the covenant sat at tables with empty chairs, each chair set for a guest who would never arrive. They poured wine into untouched cups, sliced bread they did not eat, whispered prayers to hosts no longer present. These remembrances were not mourning. They were rehearsals. They kept the philosophy alive in absence, binding each generation to the hunger of the last. Children grew up watching their elders serve food to no one, bow to silence, raise toasts to the dark. And in time, those children repeated the gestures without asking why. The covenant had achieved what every institution dreams of: survival through ritual, not reason. Meaningless repetition that becomes meaning by endurance. The guests no longer mattered. They no longer mattered. Only the act of remembering through ritual remained. And that act was enough to keep the covenant breathing. And so, when you sit at your own table, remember, ritual does not need belief to bind you. It needs only repetition. And repetition is everywhere. There are those who claim the covenant has moved into new forms entirely, that its descendants no longer need to serve flesh, nor hold feasts, nor whisper prayers, that they have learned a darker trick, that the story itself is the new meal. To speak it aloud is to serve it. To hear it is to eat it. To remember it is to carry it. By listening, you're not outside the ritual, you're inside it. Your mind is the table. Your memory is the plate. Your silence is the chain. This is why the inn resurfaces century after century, in fragments, in whispers, in rumors that never die. Because the covenant no longer needs bloodlines alone. It needs listeners. It needs believers. It needs you. And whether you deny it or not, you have already participated. The philosophy has inverted again. What was once flesh is now memory. What was once cellar is now story. What was once family is now audience. And by staying with me this far, you have proven yourself unable or unwilling to look away. That is the proof the covenant requires. Now we come to the ending, though endings are never real. The inn burned, but the covenant survived. The descendants scattered, but the hunger multiplied. The silence thickened, but the whispers carried through time until they reached you. And now you know what should have remained buried. You know that kindness can conceal corruption. You know that tables can be altars. You know that silence is participation. You know that every gift, every meal, every story may bind you more tightly than chains of iron. And you know that some truths cannot be unlearned. So hear this final warning. The inn is not gone. It waits wherever trust is blind. It waits in every open hand. It waits in every word that asks to be swallowed. And tonight, as you close your eyes, you may smell bread that should not exist. You may hear knives against plates in the silence of your room. You may feel a hand on your shoulder, though no one stands behind you. Do not turn. Do not speak. For if you acknowledge it, the covenant will know you have remembered. And if you wish to carry this knowledge without being consumed by it, you must act. Subscribe, comment, share, but not as you would for any ordinary tale. Do it as a seal, as a vow, as a way of passing the covenant onward without being devoured by it alone. Write this phrase in the comments as your mark of secrecy. The table remembers. Share it so that others may carry a piece of the burden. Keep the covenant moving, but never let it consume only you. Because the truth is simple. Once you know the story, you are already seated. Once you have listened, you have already eaten. And once you have eaten, you never leave the table.